recognition.
How'd you balance having your children and always traveling with the Yankee organization?
When I became a dad, I said that I would always love like a mother.
I feel like I have to hide certain things or act a different way because I know some people or some kids feel like they have to.
As part of the Chapters Network, Benson brings a weekly show aired worldwide on YouTube and Facebook, and her message is creating positive change. That's Wednesday at 6 p.m. on YouTube and Facebook. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. How is everyone doing today? Oh, thank you for joining. I'm Proud of You Sis. I'm host Danni Benson. Please like, share, and follow. I appreciate all the love and all the support I can get. Today was interesting. I heard the birds chirping this morning, which was music to my ears because now I know spring is around the corner. So I am so happy that winter is almost done because I'm so ready to just go out there and live life and catch up because of the last 2 years has been like such a crazy roller coaster. But I'm so happy you're joining me, and I have a special guest, Nijala Ford. She's a lawyer, and her advocacy is helping people in marriages who are suffering domestic violence, and she tries to help those people realize there is a way out and you don't have to stay. So she volunteers her time and she helps support those people in abusive relationships to get out. And with her expertise as a lawyer, it's good for her to answer those questions that maybe someone who's suffering domestic violence are getting the wrong answers. So I wanted to give this amazing woman her flowers because she's doing so much for the community. And I wanted to have you know her name, Nijala Ford. Hey, Nijala, how are you today?
Hello, hello, hello.
How are you? Thank you for joining. I'm proud of you, sis. I know you're going to drop some gems out there because, especially during COVID, a lot of people had to stay in situations that they didn't want to stay in because the lockdown happened, just quickly. So a lot of people didn't have time to plan if they were in an abusive situation to find a way to escape. So I can't even imagine all of the people who suffered domestic abuse, especially when it just seemed like every household was isolated to its own. And every municipality was kind of shut down too, because you would call, it would be busy because everyone was working from home. So, and I think about the children too, who had to see this because a lot of them were doing remote learning.
Correct.
So please drop some gems for us in how we can help these women, and also men too. Men go through domestic abuse too.
Absolutely.
So I don't want to just say women.
Yeah,
with your expertise, please explain to me what these people can do to get help.
Well, I'll start by just kind of addressing what you mentioned about the pandemic and what kind of went on for those years. So you definitely had people who were, for all intents and purposes, quarantined with their abusers. So that definitely created a lot of problems for folks. And as you mentioned, access to the courts were limited due to the fact the courts were physically not open. So typically you're able to go down to the courthouse to file for a TRO. That wasn't available for a certain period of time. And then the only other option would be to call the police to a home to, go through that process. So it's all very scary. It's all very daunting. But typically where I start with domestic violence conversations is basically so people understand what domestic violence is. It comes in so many different forms. The most common form that most folks are aware of is the physical form. But it also can show as financial abuse. It can show as mental abuse. It can show as just controlling behaviors. So I typically like to point clients or people suffering or not even necessarily aware that they're suffering from certain abuses to what's called the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel is a wheel that was created by basically a organization that does domestic violence. And they just put kind of all of the dynamics that show what this power and control. And it goes from physical to violence to sexual and goes all the way around. But it talks about using intimidation. It talks about using emotional abuse, using isolation, which is, again, what we were talking about with the pandemic. It talks about minimizing and denying and blaming. So we call that gaslighting sometimes. It also talks about using the children, making them feel guilty if they were to try to seek help for themselves. It also, when we talk about the power and control wheel, it is a wheel that was created in terms of violence against women at the hands of men. So it talks about using male privilege. And it also talks about economic abuse and the use of coercion or threats. So I've had instances where women didn't want to seek help because the threat is, if you sign up for say, a temporary restraining order, DIFUS is going to get involved. And if DIFUS gets involved, you're going to lose your children. So those are the types of threats that people sometimes are fearful of. And it's until they speak to an attorney where they actually get the facts about how the law works and what it does to protect victims. They just don't know. So they'll be living kind of in this silence, not wanting to, say, step out to seek services or seek help. So that's exactly kind of where that cycle of abuse continues. So you have some people who have been going through these issues for years or even decades, but never seek the help because they're fearful about the implications.
Wow, that's like so much information. I mean, when someone is actually in the abuse, would they even realize what you just explained to them? Because most people who are in abusive relationships are sometimes in denial or sometimes blame themselves because the abuser tends to blame that person.
Happens all the time. There's been consultations that I do with women who are, calling to say, maybe they're calling to say, I'm finally ready to get a divorce. But in that conversation, I realized that they actually have been victims of domestic violence when they describe the relationship to me. So when I hear a client or a potential client talking about they hide money from me, or I don't know what our finances are, or he makes it so that I have to ask him for money, I say, ma'am, that's financial abuse. Or if they tell me, I have to sleep with full clothes on and multiple layers so he doesn't try to have sex with me when I'm sleeping, ma'am, that's actually sexual assault. So it's, they've normalized certain behaviors that once I hear them in a consultation, I make them aware, what you've been experiencing is abuse. And it's, again, not okay. So I sometimes give them this power and control wheel. And when they look at the wheel, they're like blown away at all of the things or all of the instances where they can see hit along that wheel and what they've been through or what their experience has been. So at times they're normalizing behavior to get through the day to day. But once they kind of, take that step to even talk about potential next steps, they're informed that they actually have been experiencing abuse.
So then when they are experiencing it, does the will have something for children also?
So there are several wills that have been created over the years. So the initial will that I'm talking about, I believe it was made in the 80s, but it's still very relevant today. But that will has had multiple versions created of it. So I do believe there is one for children, but using the children is part of the main person's power and control will, because you hear a lot of threats. If you try to come after me for say my money, or you try to leave me, or you try to divorce me, I'm going to make sure that I take your children away. And in some unfortunate cases, I've seen that happen. So when a woman has left their abuser and then also lost their children just because they don't have an advocate advising them through. And I always say that people make the biggest mistake when they decide not to lawyer up when these situations are happening, because it's not intuitive. The law doesn't necessarily make sense. There are rules at play that you have to be educated about, and you have to learn to make these good decisions so that you can take the steps correctly. And I have women all the time say, well, I'm a good mother. I was a good wife. I was the victim of abuse. How did I lose my children? And I explain, abuse can even be through the legal system. If you have somebody who abused you and controlled you, and now they know they can, say, file false complaints or attack your credibility, or attack, even if you have, say, mental health diagnoses or things like that. If they know this information about you, they can use it as a sword. I've even had instances where abusers have gotten restraining orders against the victims. So, things like that can happen, but that's why it's so important to almost start with the legal, again, if people are in unsafe situations, you have to assess what the level of risk is, because you may need to start with the police or a shelter or something like that if you just need to get out or get away. But the next thing you want to do is speak to an attorney. And there's plenty of organizations that do these services for free and actually have attorneys for free that can help you with domestic violence specific issues. But you definitely want somebody that's going to help explain the law to you so that you don't kind of put yourself in missteps. I had a client call today for a consultation where, she has a temporary restraining order against her child's father. And with that restraining order, it bars all contact. So she left, to go live in a different state. So now he's filing against her to have the child removed and brought back to New Jersey, when she basically was fleeing to go back to her parents' home to be away from this man. So again, what she said to me was, my biggest mistake was not talking to an attorney earlier, or, first. It was kind of taking actions and then now having to react to those actions legally. But that's when people are kind of, so I love to be in front of it. I love to be the person who is helping to make the decisions as we go along. Again, a lot of my job is cleanup. I don't mind that part either, but it just becomes an uphill battle when, dealing with these types of issues.
Well, I wanted to ask for the women out there, if you are suffering from, domestic violence, do you advise them, if they are trying to escape, to bring the children with them?
So, everybody's situation is really different. I've had, potential clients or clients who maybe can't afford to take their children with them, right?
But doesn't that affect them in court? Like if they leave the kids behind, and it seems like it's abandonment, meaning like it depends what judge you get. Some judge will understand, and some judge would be like, well, why would you leave your kids with the abuser?
And here's the thing, I say all the time, even to victims of abuse, because I have to explain often that at least in New Jersey, it's presumed that each child deserves to have two parents. So I have clients who have final restraining orders, and final restraining orders in New Jersey are forever, unless somebody moves to dismiss them, or somebody goes to have a judge, review it.
Withdraw it, right?
So somebody who has one can always withdraw it, but the only other way to get rid of it is if the person, that has the restraining order against them motions the judge to review the situation. So I have clients that are also trying to get rid of restraining orders because maybe the restraining order has been against them for 20 years. They haven't seen this person in 20 years. So it's kind of not a relevant thing once that person's not in danger, or whether the parties have not had a relationship anymore. But what I was explaining was, even though this person, you may have a final restraining order, meaning they can never have contact with you ever again, you still may have to co-parent with this person.
And then how do you do that?
It's rough. So typically what happens is everything has to go either through a third party, or, you're using police station pickups and drop-offs. You're only dropping off at the school so that you're not having any contact. So it becomes very difficult. And there's a lot of things where you still may have to keep that person informed of, how the child is doing in school or medical decisions that come up. When the abuse is like really, really severe, sometimes courts will suspend custody or suspend parenting time. But as I mentioned, that's just not always the case. So it's possible to be in a situation where you still have to work with this abuser for, say, until your children are emancipated, or through college sometimes, which can be almost victimizing again.
So if a woman or a man goes to court and says this person is abusing me, would they have to show proof, like police reports? Like what do they have to do to document what is actually going on in a home to be believed?
So it's tough. So it's pretty, I would say it's pretty easy to get a temporary restraining order, which is the first step. It's a bit harder to prove that there needs to be a final restraining order. As I mentioned, in New Jersey, at least, final restraining orders are permanent. And they also include the loss of basically your Second Amendment rights. So you're never allowed to own weapons or guns or anything ever again while this restraining order is in place. When you travel, you may be stopped and flagged at, customs and things like that. So it's a big deal once one is actually granted. So judges aren't just so easy to just, give them out. But what you do need to have is, it's a credibility contest to a certain degree. But if you're being, say, a lot of things fall under domestic violence. It's not just the hitting and punching. Sometimes it's harassment. Sometimes it's stalking.
Sometimes it's emotional abuse, mental abuse.
With emotional abuse, even still, it depends on what type of emotional abuse. If it's including threatening language, maybe. But if it's just saying, "Oh, you're ugly," or you know what I mean, like it's just kind of like belittling, that may not raise to the level of domestic violence that will allow you to be granted a restraining order. So it gets tricky. It does get tricky. But one thing that I will say is, when I have clients that are victims of domestic violence, I say, show me everything. Do you have pictures of your injuries? Do you have text messages where he was threatening? Do you have any videos? Did you capture any of this on recording? I'm asking for everything they do have. Did you even keep a journal that you wrote down, today John hit me? Are you documenting it for yourself? Because it does, to a certain degree, we want to see that something has been proven. And the tough ones are when there's just kind of a history of domestic abuse, but never, people never report it. So I always encourage people, we definitely still have a lot of underreporting of abuse, which is one of the toughest hurdles to climb because, now, unless there's some major incident again, we say, okay, well, not we, but people will say, okay, well, this has been happening for this amount of time. But you never called the police. You never, sought services. You never,
But you know what's so crazy about that is because if I am living with the abuser and I have nowhere to go, the last thing I want to do, some people want to do, is call the police because they feel like they're agitating the situation.
Absolutely.
And the police come, but the police don't stay with you. They eventually leave. And now you might have to come back to deal with the abuser. So a lot of people don't understand, like people feel like, oh, if you don't call the cops or the police, that means it didn't happen. No, that's not true. It's absolutely probably maybe the fear for your life.
Well, and that's why I love women's organizations that do domestic violence specifically, because they will help you with exit strategy planning. So it's about learning what resources are available to you besides just calling the police. So I do encourage, and even these websites, if you were to search a domestic violence website, they have safe buttons on their website. So if your abuser came in the house, there's a button you can hit that just shuts it down, and it doesn't save on your cookies so that they don't know that you've been researching this stuff. But a lot of women are just not aware. And I think awareness of what options you have besides just calling the police or besides just filing for a restraining order immediately are helpful, because you might be able to have an appointment with one of these organizations and they can actually help you find housing, find other resources. And like I said, money is the biggest reason why, or not money specifically, but the stability of a household. My kids have to eat, they have to go to school. How am I going to do this but for being with this person? So that becomes a major hurdle. So we want to encourage women to at least reach out to organizations that can help them make that plan, help them put those steps in play, and so that they're able to exit safely without major incident.
So do these women have access to free representation, or it has to be you have to like meet a certain criteria to get free representation? Like, how does that work if I'm looking for a lawyer because I'm trying to get out of my marriage? When you Google, there's so many different lawyers. I don't even know where to start. So how is there like a specific website that people who are lawyers are a part of this organization where you can go and look at and check, as opposed to calling lawyers to see if there are advocacy for people in domestic violence situations in their marriage?
So I will say a lot of family attorneys, I am a family attorney, so I do the full spectrum in terms of divorce, custody, child support, but I also do domestic violence, which is somewhat rare. A lot of family attorneys don't want to touch it. But I am.
And why is that? Why do they not want to touch it?
Because it can be messy in terms of a lot of work, a lot of emotion, sometimes, you have to explain to people, I know you're experiencing, you're fearful of this person, you're experiencing emotional abuse, but sometimes you're not going to be successful in getting a restraining order. You're not going to be successful in getting that man out of the house. Or, after you have that restraining order and it's dismissed, that person gets to come right back home. So some attorneys just want to skip it. But when women are facing these issues, like I said, there are organizations, like I know in New Jersey specifically, we have organizations where they would contact to help them with this exit strategy planning, getting back on their feet. But they also have attorneys that are employed by the organization. And those attorneys will represent clients for free because it falls under domestic violence. So they may not be able to do your divorce for you, but they can help you in getting a restraining order. New York also has one too. In New York, it's called Sanctuary for Women. I used to volunteer there when I was in law school. So they actually sit in the courthouse when people come in by themselves. They'll say, do you need help with filing your petition for a restraining order? And it's free, totally free. And it's really free for people who are under a certain income. But even still, because it falls under domestic violence, they can pretty much help most folks get the resources.
Do judge have empathy for women who are in domestic violence situations, or do they just are straightforward?
I think in general, I know the laws in New Jersey are geared towards protecting victims. And I'll say victims, but a judge will say alleged victim until it's
proven.
But at the same time, the burden is really about credibility. When they're assessing both people, right? What are you showing me in terms of proof? Because sometimes we have cases where it wasn't necessarily abuse. You weren't necessarily getting hit. You guys engaged in a mutual fight, which now becomes something different. Is it a toxic environment? Absolutely. But is it domestic violence? Maybe not. So that's what a judge's first job is, to assess credibility and just to see if this is valid or not. But they do absolutely give empathy, because they're going to get a complaint that says, oh, well, for the past 10 years, he's been putting his hands on me or doing, things like that. So they're going to go in, with you as, the person complaining, to allow you to explain your case and say what you need to say. But they also have to be fair in terms of somebody is only, guilty of these things, or in the domestic violence sphere, means they have to have an order of protection once a judge finds that your complaint is credible. So they do have to kind of toe the line in terms of, there are actual trials for domestic violence in New Jersey. So when you're doing a trial, it's a trial like anything else. You're able to present exhibits, question witnesses, all of that. So I always say too, if family members, if you've ever been hit in front of a family member, that person can testify. So it's just about knowing your rights and knowing your options and knowing how to put on your case in a way that you really can get the relief that you need and the protection that you need.
Well, I know you said something about, sometimes it could be a mutual fight, but if you're suffering from domestic violence, isn't it expected for you to try to fight back?
Well, and that was just a quick example, but
Yeah, I'm
sometimes,
just
but what I'm saying is sometimes there's a history of them mutually fighting over the years. I had a client who actually was on the other end of a filing for a restraining order. But when I'm going through the evidence and I'm going through his relationship and the text messages from the alleged victim, I see her speaking to him in abusive ways. I also get a police report. She had actually stabbed him in the past. And, so it's one of those things where now it's murky. I can't say that you specifically were, it might have been mutual abuse. It might have been mutual domestic violence. And that's kind of what it looked like. So something like that, it's almost going to cancel each other out. So, if you're in a situation where now you're like fighting for your life, that's a good red flag that it's time to go. And I tell women all the time, you may end up with an attempted murder charge for trying to protect yourself. Because the woman in this last example definitely was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So
wow.
You don't want to find yourself, getting to the point where now you have to feel like you have to attack this person back. It's gone way too far, and it could have major implications for your life and your freedom.
So your best advice is, instead of trying to retaliate, just make a plan in how you're going to leave the situation, because that's a better plan than trying to retaliate, where you might get into a sticky situation where now you have to prove that you were actually being abused and you were doing whatever you did in self-defense. Right. Which might get complicated in court, especially if you don't have any track record of it, if you have never called before, like the police, if you don't have, like you said, journal, or, family members have seen it. Because most times it's you against the other person. It's he said, she said. It's like most times, unless their kids are in the room with you, you got to see who you have to believe. And I'm imagining both sides are going to say, the abuser is going to say, I didn't do anything.
Correct.
And then the other person is going to say, yes, you did. And so it's like,
yeah,
it's I don't even know how you even talk about credibility in court, because, these judges don't know either person. They're just presented evidence. So do you just believe the woman because most women get abused? I mean, it's a really sticky situation.
Correct. And again, this is why representation is important. You are the advocate for your client, and it's your job to show that your client is the credible person to believe. And that's what, honestly, we get paid to do. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I just always encourage women, speak to an attorney, speak to one of these women's organizations.
Yes.
If it's a scary situation, call the police. If you're under attack, call the police. And that's, I always put safety first when talking with any clients. And that's an important thing.
Well, thank you so much, Elijah Ford. Please look for her. Tell them your handle so people can find you.
You can find me on Instagram at Nijala Ford Law, and then my website is also NijalaFordLaw.com.
And please spread the word. If you are involved in a domestic abuse situation, or a family or a friend who's looking for help, please contact Miss Ford, and she can be a resource and a help to your loved ones. But thank you so much for coming on. I'm proud of you, sis. This was amazing information that will help someone and maybe save a life. So thank you for coming. I want to give you your flowers. You're super amazing. And thank you for giving your time to the community. Thank you so much, Miss Ford. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.